world of the early 20th century in advertising. And his next project, which actually has brought him here, is looking at managerial capitalism. That is like the upcoming project of his. So small town capitalism, brand name capitalism, what we're talking about today, and managerial capitalism, the Douglas Haynes trilogy. So we are delighted to have you here. And without further ado, over to you, Doug. It's going to be a really nice presentation. All of you, many of you have not seen these advertisements. Just to read out some of the brands which I mentioned. Horlicks, all of you heard of Horlicks, right? Lifebuoy, Lux, and so on. These are kind of iconic brands of Indian history, and they have really, they were there around in the time period that we are talking about as well. So over to you, Doug.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So are the slides coming up here? Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to check because I know that there's a virtual aspect to this as well. So, and let's see, where's the clicker? Oh, here. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you. Jim, I didn't mention that much about my current project, which is really about the IIM and the creation of a managerial capitalism. So I'm, half of my project is looking at IIM and half is going to be looking at what happened to the early students after they left IIM. But it's a special pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Chinmay and Rina and the many others who is a huge staff that has become involved in organizing this occasion. And I also want to thank the library staff for all the help they've given in the course of my current research. Well, it was different. It's a bit hard to switch gears from the project I'm working on to a project that left my hands maybe 9 months ago or so, except with the exception of going over copy editing and so on. In discussing the book, Chinmay mentioned that there was a lot of social history and a lot of looking at advertisements, but I conceive of the book as first and foremost an unusual kind of business history that's really about the advent of industrial, the entry of global capitalism and the rise of the development of professional advertising in India. So during the 1920s, the industrial producers of Europe and America increasingly tried to sell their goods in India to a middle-class consumer base. But they realized that they lacked the ability to convince the middle-class buyers to purchase their goods, so they turned to professional advertisers to do this in India. And this is really the time when the first professional advertisers come to India during the 1920s, and then in a bigger way in the 1930s. So my book is really about how did professional advertising get a foothold in India so that it would be positioned to assume a really large significance after 1947. I'm going to have some hesitations here about the achievements before 1947. Now, I arrived at the topic of advertising in the course of doing research on what was originally conceived of as a book on consumption and middle-class consumption patterns. And I was going to look at advertising as to get evidence on what middle-class consumption patterns were. And I started going into the advertisements, and they were just fascinating, something I hadn't realized before. And at the time I started, there was actually very little work had been done on the history of advertising. More has been done now, but often in articles, not always in a big way in full-scale books. So it's not really a topic that historians of South Asia have looked at all that much. in contrast to anthropologists, political scientists, and even economists. But the history of advertisement is something that's been overlooked. But everyone who does newspaper research has seen these advertisements, and sometimes people include an ad or two in their book to illustrate some point about the subject they're talking about, but have overlooked the subject of advertising itself. So I decided as I went through newspaper advertisement, and I realized it was going to take me a long time to get through these advertisements, and I wouldn't have time to look at the other aspects of my original study. So I decided to focus in on what was going on in these advertisements. And my main point is that if we don't understand advertising historically, our appreciation of the development of consumer-oriented capitalism in South Asia is always going to be limited. So my book has four main arguments. First, roughly around 1920, and especially during the 1930s, new forms of consumer-oriented global and Indian capitalism began to enter the Indian marketplace with the goal of converting people they identified as members of the urban middle class to the use of brand name products in everyday life. This really reflected the rise of a new kind of global enterprise in India, one that had started to make inroads on the place of the agency houses that had been dealing in raw materials and the distribution of cloth from Europe and so on. And as these new kinds of capitalists entered into the Indian market, they began to turn to advertising professionals in order to make this possible. So they started to rely on advertisers for two main purposes. And one point to make is that they weren't so much interested in competing with other global capitalists at this time as they were in establishing the importance of brand name products completely. So let me just see, this is supposed to go. And what's happening here? Is that okay? Go ahead. So I'm just showing, but just showing some ads. So some early ads as examples here. So basically, a point that I want to stress is that up to this point, most goods that Indians consumed were unbranded products, and that the market in India for unbranded products is still very, very large, but at this time it was much higher. So one of the tasks that global advertisers had to take up was to convert people to stop using unbranded products and to use branded products. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is to try to, I'm sorry, I should give you some, those were just examples of ads. But during this period, I should also say there are some local firms, Indian firms, that began also to advertise and to establish a certain brand name, you might say, as well. This is Ahmedabad pharmacy, which I think was in Lahore. This is a product named Jodi Booty, which was from Ambala in the Punjab. This was Dut Papeshwar, which was a Ayurvedic company that runs out of Panvel, which is in the Bombay metropolitan area now. And this was Shanti Mrut, which I don't know where this was located. I've been having all kinds of computer problems over the last 24 hours, so I was trying to get an example of an ad from a store in Ahmedabad that was run by a woman selling medical products. But basically what I want to suggest is that a kind of vernacular capitalism emerged, a kind of local capitalism that was selling medical products, hair oil, biddies, and incense, calendars, and so on. And so to some extent, these global capitalists were competing with these vernacular capitalists in trying to get into the Indian consumer market. So this is a big task that they're involved in. Okay, yeah. So here, so that's one thing that's going on. But the other thing that's going on is that they're also trying to get people, persuade people to change their bodily habits. So by this I mean to use soap, to smoke cigarettes rather than biddies, to use toothpaste rather than using neem twigs, and so on. So there are two aspects, trying to change how people actually carry on the ordinary everyday bodily habits. And so they are trying to focus on the everyday changes that are in people's life. Okay, so there's these two main purposes, and that's an object of global capitalism. One, to give an example of the first process, this ad comes from the Times of India, and what this ad is probably not legible in the back, but it's an ad for advertisements. And basically, the point of this ad is buy brand name products. It's not saying which product, it's saying buy brand name products. And the argument is basically you should buy advertised goods. And why should you buy them? It's because they're advertised. So that's the logic of this particular ad. Buy cocoa gem, which is a cooking substance that you can buy in a tinned form, rather than buying ghee in the market. So it's a ghee substitute, and so on. So replacing products that people used, and here in terms of changing bodily habits, it may not be so clear, but this is what's going on here is urging housewives to buy Sunlight soap rather than to send their clothes to the Dobie, because what will happen is the Dobie will beat the clothes on a rock, and the clothes will tear, as you see in the upper picture. And you should instead use Sunlight soap in a tub in your home, and the housewife should do this herself rather than send the clothes out to Adobe. So down below, it's probably not discernible, is a 4-step process teaching housewives how to clean clothes using Sunlight soap. So it's actually suggesting a change in the allocation of labor within the household, displacing, don't send your clothes out to the Adobe, you do it in the home, and it's the wife who should do it. Not all these products were labor saving by any means. Okay. Now the second main argument of the book is that the effort to foster new modes of consumption on the subcontinent through advertising didn't just involve an attempt to transport universal consumer values and advertising methods from the West to India. Rather, advertisers sought to develop sales pitches that they thought would be meaningful and emotive to Indian middle-class consumers. So they, in the 1920s, before the advent of professional advertisers, what many of these companies did is they simply exported their ads from Europe and placed them in the newspapers. And so this is an ad that is not any different than an ad that would have been in a British newspaper, except for the difference of the local agent is down at the bottom. And so that was very typical of what these global advertisers did at this stage. So when you have professional advertisers coming in, the professional advertisers are not just saying, we know new techniques of selling goods. They're saying, we understand India better than you, the manufacturer. And so we're going to serve as kind of cultural mediators in this process. And they stress that they have kinds of cultural knowledge that the manufacturers don't have. The cultural knowledge comes from rudimentary market surveys, but their cultural knowledge also came from the subordinates within their own offices, who are often members of the middle class themselves, who translated ads, who sometimes tweaked the actual language of the ads in various ways. We'll see that tweaking in a minute, and who drew the images. So this was, I should have come to this image earlier, but the previous one was obviously an image. I'm sorry. The previous one was obviously an image of that had been developed in Europe. This one, I think, was an image that had been developed in the United States. And what happened is when it came to India, they colored the woman's hair black and put a bindi on her head. But it doesn't seem very likely that this was originally drawn as an Indian image. So these are kinds of typical early ads. But once you have Indian artists being hired by advertising firms, they can do certain things that the Europeans on their own wouldn't do. And so this is an ad for insurance, which is, why should you not be thinking about the situation your widow would face when you die, and you're really nice to your wife while you're alive, but you don't think about your widow. But the drawing of the widow, I think, is something that involves some kind of local cultural expertise that the Europeans were unlikely to have. And this is another example. This is dowry insurance. Basically, what's being pictured is a successful wedding, and the woman is taking leave of her mother at the wedding as a new husband looks on. And again, I think this is a kind of drawing that a European was not likely to have generated on his own. So this is what I mean about the input of Indian subordinates. And I do want to stress they were always subordinates and they were always male during this period. I hope my voice is going to hold out. So again, stressing the ability to pitch ads. The advertising agency are claiming they have the ability to pitch ads to an Indian audience. Here's another one with Krishna in the middle for Woodward's gripe water that you couldn't imagine a European having drawn. Okay, so I guess I'm jumping the gun here. I don't know how to go back. There, that will go. Okay, okay. So that's the second argument. Now, the third argument is, I'll try to be briefer here, is that during the course of the 1930s, a number of ads for different products start to coalesce around the idea of the conjugal family and the idea of conjugality. The relationship between the husband and wife, the importance of the family taking care of the children, and especially what emerges in this is the importance of taking care of the health of children. So that's something that runs through several different kinds of products. And so the last 2/3 of the book is looking at different products, going from tonics to products sold to women, to soap, to vegetable oil, to electrical products, and so on. And to a great extent, every different sellers of different kinds of products are coming together around this idea of conjugality, and that's why conjugality comes into the product, into the name. And I'm arguing here that by evoking the idea of conjugality, they're linking themselves to a change that's already happening in middle-class society. The emphasis on the conjugality that has been studied in analysis of social reform writings and literature and so on, but hasn't been really noticed in advertisement. So they don't create the idea of conjugality. They are building upon something that is already going on within Indian society at the time, middle-class society, I should stress. Okay. So, and the fourth, I'm sorry, I'm still going ahead. The fourth argument is this project that's going on of introducing consumer-based capitalism is a very incomplete process. It's, first of all, it's only being addressed to the top 1/3 at most of urban society, and especially to educated middle-class Indians. First of all, there's very little going on in the countryside as far as marketing of these products is concerned. Secondly, even in relation to members of the middle class, they're more successful in certain products than they are in others. For instance, in trying to market clothing, very little effort is made in terms of advertising. Unbranded products being sold by the big Indian mills are really the dominant form of things that people are buying, especially women during this time. So it's not, the advance of brand name capitalism isn't going across evenly across all kinds of products. And the third thing to stress is that they have to adjust themselves to the concerns of Indian consumers, the anxieties and preoccupations, particularly about the reproduction of the family. Adds through this period very little stress on pleasure. There's you have ads for cigarettes. What's good about a cigarette is the vitality that it gives you to deal with the everyday aspects of life, not the pleasure that you would have from smoking a cigarette or drinking a beer or so on. So pleasure, keeping up with the Joneses, these are not values that are being evoked at the time. Okay, now the next point I want to come to is something that was raised in Chinmay's introduction, is my method. And basically what I would say is that I'm using a very unconventional method for the most part. Yes, I'm using archival sources such as those that Chinmay mentioned, but those are very limited. Most of the companies don't let you see their archives. There are a few that do, but the companies don't really speak to the business strategies that were involved in these various companies. That the archives don't speak to those issues. So how do you determine the cultural strategies that were involved when you have only snippets of this kind of information? And basically what I'm suggesting is that you have to look at the advertisements themselves and see what's going on. That can seem obvious with some ads and a little more complicated in others. And my main method that I'm using is to juxtapose ads that are geared, that have different purposes against each other, and look at how they relate to one another. So one way of looking at this is to look at the difference between ads geared to the middle class and to European expatriates. I'm going to talk about this image on the left a bit more later, so I'm not going to say much about it now. But the image on the right is geared to a European expatriate. Is basically like, if you can't cope with the heat of India, you can ruin your health and your career, and you'll go back and you'll be ashamed to the Anglo-Saxon race, essentially. You know, I think the drawing is very telling. That I think the dog is a really nice touch there. You would never see a dog in an image geared to an Indian middle class audience. So same manufacturer selling in very different ways. So I think you could clearly see the strategy that was going on. Okay, image of Sunlight soap being sold to European women on the left, and to Indian women on the right. And I guess the point to stress here is that both of these ads rely on a strategy of a conversation among women. So you're not hearing from the advertiser. The conversation that you're hearing is of the women, but they say very different things and very different images, obviously. So that's one kind of contrast. Another contrast is what kind of advertising was being used to address Indian consumers, and what kind of advertising was used outside of India. And so these are ads for a product named Faluna, which is a medicine for women. And you see here two ads for Faluna, one which is addressed to the husband, the one on the left, and the other stressing the value of motherhood. Unfortunately, last night I zapped the contrast ad and could not recover that, which was a European woman. This was an ad in the South African context, a European woman going out to a party in which she would meet men and date and so on. So you would not see that kind of ad geared to a Indian middle class audience. Okay, so that's another thing. Another theme here, and I'll talk about this these images a bit more later, is the convergence of different ads around a single motif or trope. And the visual trope I want to point to here is the weak man who can't really generate the energy even to stand up, and the woman standing over him in a figure of compassion and anxiety about his health and so on. So we'll see that this image came up in many different contexts. So that's another kind of juxtaposition, looking at the similarities between ads. But the main focus that I have in the book is to look at how campaigns for the same product evolved over time as the advertisers felt they started to get a more and more sophisticated idea of the Indian audience. And so that's what I want to focus in most in the time that remains. I want to look at one kind of advertisement that seems sort of outdated now. I don't think you see that many ads for male tonics today, but they were the most common form of ad, I think, in the 20s and 30s, and especially in vernacular newspapers. And these ads drew upon a logic of male weakness. This is something that historians have talked about a lot, how the colonial rulers came to conceive of educated males as weak, and the term was effeminate that was sometimes used, and how these ideas sometimes became internalized by Indians and Indian nationalists fought by organizing military drilling and this sort of thing, trying to fight against this stereotype. And so the theme of weakness runs through these advertisements. And right now I'm pointing out vernacular advertisements. These are ads that, not the global ads, but the ads of vernacular firms. And I want to stress here that there's also a sexual logic in these ads. And the logic is a little bit clearer here. And especially here, and I'm going to look at this ad. So basically, in many of these male tonic ads, they're referring to sexual weakness. And the logic is that in some cases that men who indulged in bad habits in their youth, meaning masturbation and so on, have often lost their capacity to perform their marital obligations and need a tonic to restore their capacity to indulge in sex. And so this was a major theme in advertisement in the vernacular sector. But what's interesting is in the 20s, the big global companies stayed away from this theme. And so you could see physical fitness. You could see, again, the European here, good health. Here in the next one, you see the great tonic for those who are weak. So the idea of weakness is in this ad for this global commodity, and so on. But you could basically the European ads were quite different during the 20s. But what I'm suggesting happens, one thing that happens by the 1930s is these global firms realize they're losing out on a big part of the market, a big part of why Indian men are buying tonics by skipping this theme. And so by the 1930s, the idea of selling tonics on the basis of sexual properties becomes more open, and and particularly open in this ad for Ocasa, which was a German product. And this is for sonotogen. The same logic. I can't go into the detail in this particular image. Again, the same thing. It's very clear here. But one of the new things that's being added here is the importance of sex to the sexual satisfaction of the housewife and to reproduction in many cases. Okay, now so we come to this ad, which we've seen already in a couple of cases, and I want to stress here again that it was something that maybe we didn't notice before. We saw the woman standing over the weak man here. We may not have noticed the bed in the background. We may not have noticed in the text the importance of being fertile, having vitality, this sort of thing, which was a coded language for sexual capacity. And so this becomes very important to the European ads during this period. And increasingly, again, they're focusing on the relationship between husband and wife. And I just want to point out, this was an earlier ad. We already saw this, but the woman standing over the man, the woman is a marker of the shame that the man is facing. The important thing about the top left picture is that the couple is childless at this point, and in the second picture, the couple has a child. Um, um, and then by 1940, you get these images of marital happiness ads, is what I call them, that really focus on sexual intimacy between husband and wife. And they were a very large number of such ads focusing on the companionship and sexual satisfaction that a woman would experience in the sexual act. And I'm arguing that basically this reflects the influence of sexual science, which comes to India around this time. People like Marie Stopes and Margaret Sanger and R.D. Curvey and A.P. Pillai. So this is one example of the emphasis on conjugality. Now I want to come I've been talking about sex tonics in a general sense. And now I want to, male tonics in a general sense. I want to come to another product that was sold as a tonic product. Here's some other ads. And I want to stress the cinematic feel to the pictures in these ads. But the product I want to talk about now is Horlicks, which was sold as a tonic product. And you'll see that it becomes sold primarily to men by the late 1930s. This wasn't the case in the early, around 1928, 1929. There was a different kind of pitch. Now, Horlicks doesn't have to be sold in this way. The research assistant who helped me in with my presentation, he said, "I really like Horlicks. You could sell Horlicks for the taste of it." And so that's one way you could sell Horlicks. Horlicks has been sold. I don't know what the advertising method now is, but a few years ago it was, if you give Horlicks to your children, they can be this much taller when they grow up, and that sort of thing. So, but in this period, there's a very different tack taken. Now here you see late 20s, some ads for Horlicks, in which Horlicks was sold as an energy drink. You can see the kind of pitch toward the Europeans to a certain extent. This says the Raja, again, an image of martial vigor and so on. And then in the mid-30s, J. Walter Thompson takes over the account of Horlicks. And J. Walter Thompson develops a twofold strategy. One is selling Horlicks as something that is healthy for children. And in this ad, it's a cartoon sequence. It may be a little too jumbled to see, but basically what we have at the top left in the beginning of this sequence is a child is always finishing last in races, and the mother is very worried about him and goes to a doctor, and the doctor recommends taking Horlicks on a regular basis. And at the end, the child is winning races. So that's one pitch that was being adopted. And the other was convalescence, or in other words, Horlicks was a product that would be good when children are sick or anyone in the family is sick. So these are the two main tacks that were taken. But by 1936, 1937, J. Walter Thompson has decided on a very different strategy, perhaps prompted by its competition with Ovaltine, which was selling, Ovaltine was selling its kind of, its drinks, barley drinks. It was selling them on the basis of mothers needing to take care of their children and so on. So it was based upon women. Horlicks ends up focusing a campaign on men and their need to become energetic and fit for the workplace in a time where employment insecurity was very high. So here's an example. Government official loses promotion through night starvation. And the typical image, I can show a couple more like this. Salesman gets off his job by conquering night starvation and so on. So you see middle-class men in a variety of situations who initially in the first sequence, they're in danger of losing their job or they're not going to get a promotion or something like that. Someone sends them to a doctor. The doctor says, you should take Horlicks on a regular basis. And by the end, start taking Horlicks on a regular basis, and they're succeeding in their field. Again, in the cartoon sequence. The interesting thing one of the interesting things about these ads is the slogan night starvation. The slogan night starvation comes from outside India. It was used regularly in international campaigns. So someone in Horlicks said, we've got to use that slogan, night starvation, in India. But in India, of course, starvation is not just a metaphor, it's something that's very real. And the idea of night starvation doesn't seem to have a particularly powerful hold. I should say night starvation was also seen as, when you take Horlicks, the idea was that you get a better night's sleep as well. So one thing you may not be able to notice here is in a little translation of night starvation at the bottom in English letters, but in the vernacular language. And this one says sabere ki kamjori, so morning weakness, in other words. And so the meaning has been totally changed. And when you get to vernacular ads that have no English, the night starvation completely disappears, and it's only sabere ki kamjori. And so again, coming back to that theme of male weakness that we see running in the tonic ads. Again, there's the issue of possibly losing your job if you're weak and you don't have the right energy. But you might, if in some of these ads, they specifically stress you might not be able to advance the cause of your son's education and so on. If you lose the job, you won't be able to afford the same schools and so on. So the back to the family is being stressed, and here is avoided by his children because of night starvation. So the idea was the husband is too grumpy and weak all the time to play with his children, and the children fear to interact with him until he's taken Horlicks, and then they can they are willing to interact with him. So that's the theme of that's this one theme of the tonics. I don't have time to get into soap and so on, but I do just want to give a 1-minute survey of what I say about soap, and that is that a lot of this discussion ends up being about Lifebuoy soap and the attempt to put into place this slogan of BO, or body odor, that was an international slogan, and it just fails in India. Partly the problem of translating BO into another language. You can't keep the same letters when you move to Indian languages. So you'll see that in say these pictures. So they give an Indian translation of what BO is there, and by this ad, BO has disappeared as shava. So they abandon BO altogether by 1939, and the theme of a child's health becomes important. And you can see here the woman with her son in the picture, and the mother guarding over her children. So I think I'll just stop here and stress that, you know, what I'm saying is advertising is interesting. Advertising says something about the advent of global capitalism. Global capitalism isn't just sort of bringing a wholly Western set of values. With professional advertisers are keen on adjusting ads to what they see, at least, as the values of the Indian middle class during this period. And the value of conjugality gets stressed very highly in these ads in various forms, whether it's the husband's role in the family or the woman's role in the family. The health of children that is manifested in different ways, but this is something that runs all through these ads until the 1940s. And in the 1940s, you see, as the Europeans start to leave, you see a lot more ads focus on nationhood and these kinds of things, with the global firms we're avoiding altogether in this period. So I'll leave it there, and I'll let Chinmay offer some comments.
Yeah, I think we should open it up for Q&A. I'll just speak for 1 or 2 minutes. This is a field very close to my heart as well. In fact, at IIMA, some of us have been working on advertising history, and of course, looking at some of the professional advertisers of this time. Another theme, Doug has dealt with this in other places, of course, Swadeshi, right? So the idea that, so a lot of the ads at this time also talk about being Indian, right? So if you look at a lot of these ads in this time period, and that precedes kind of 1920s, for example, Godrej ads, they're showing, you can, this product is as good as the Europeans. So that's another theme which is very common in this time period. But what, Doug's book really does well is, he's looking at different languages, right? So it's not, for example, the Times of India now, we have the digital, the Times of India is being digitized. You can sit in the library out here and you have every article published at your fingertips. That's easy to do. What Doug has really sat through is a lot of these different newspapers, different languages, and very cleverly used, because you don't have the archives, as you said, of the companies, but you can infer something about their strategies by looking at how they pitch the same product in different newspapers, right? And he's made some very, insightful interpretations out of that. So like his previous book on, small town capitalism, major strength of his historical scholarship is by looking at a variety of sources to try and make some, meaningful interpretations. The stuff on, conjugality, I think all of us had these aha moments when we saw many of these things. As a quasi-government employee, scared about losing my job if I don't have Horlicks. Good pitch to have Horlicks even today. Open to questions. Anybody? Feel free to raise your hand. I'll kind of collate some questions, and then Doug you can sit there and
I'll wait till the questions are out. Maybe a couple of questions, and then I'll move.
Sure. I'll start by asking it. I'll start by asking a few questions, and then give it over to Professor Makram Mehta. I should also say we have a lot of historians in the room right now. My question is, in India right now, one of the big touching points of advertisement is the world of fairness creams, right? Were there fairness cream advertisements in this world of 1920?
There you go.
Mike is there.
Yeah. I don't need to. Yes, there were fairness creams, and actually someone from BBC interviewed me about 2 weeks ago, and there's an article about this and the pitch to the female consumer. One of the things I didn't talk about here is the growing emphasis on the female consumer and the recognition that women make the decisions in families. That the professional advertisers come to recognize by the later 1930s. I could tell a funny story about that, but that's not addressing your question. So I probably should, if someone wants that story later, they can ask it about. But yes, there were fairness creams, and And I should add that there's a switch from using Hollywood actresses to using Bollywood actresses from the late 30s to the early 40s, but still the stress on the fairness of their skin is very much there. Yeah.
Interesting. And this whole chapter on how the idea of beauty is shaped and so on. Another question, in this time, the colonial context is there, very strong. The freedom movement is there. Yeah. Do you come across anything about how the people in politics are talking about advertisements, if at all? Are they using some of these ideas in political propaganda as well?
Yeah. Well, one thing, I don't know if we can go back. Are we through with the slide?
We can put it back on.
But I wanted to show, you mentioned Swadeshi, but of course my focus is on these global firms, and the global firms were not using Swadeshi. And in fact, they ended up, I don't know if my, let's see.
You can see here. Yeah.
Okay, so let me go back to, it has to be go back way to the beginning to see if it's there. I suspect it's not even there. So anyway, two things that happen is I'll go to one ad is that the Indian firms who start to get involved in the soap business do stress the Swadeshi to a very great extent, and the Europeans end up having to counter that in their ads. So one thing that happens with Unilever is it moves its plant to India, and by the late 1930s, there's a little thing at the bottom said "Made in India" with vegetable oils only. So they're trying to counter the impression that they're a foreign product, and that that they're use a lot of meat products, which in fact they did. But this is the ad for Godrej, which I think is the all-time classic ad, which is not just we're Indian, but those Europeans use parts from rats, cats, dogs, cows, and human excreta in their production. And so if if you want pure vegetable products, you should use Godrej soap. So, but I could provide some other more specific examples of Swadeshi appeal with Tata Oil Mills Company uses that, and Godrej. And so that continues on. But again, the focus in my project is what are these international firms doing? So they by nature had to play down any Swadeshi aspect. So
thank you so much. Yeah, Professor Mehta.
See, Swadeshi movement had taken place much before these advertisements came appearing. I have seen large number of advertisements published in Gujarat Mitra from Surat, which was started in 1863. I've also seen, I took you to the Prajabandhu office in Gujarat to Gazette. But I have seen many advertisements in Prajabandhu prior to First World War. For instance, take the example Lord Curzon, who partitioned India in 1904.
Bengal,
This was very much followed by Swadeshi movement before Gandhi. And we see lots of advertisements, including the advertisement for the plague. plague which took place in 1899, 1900, along with Hopkins Institute, Professor T.K. Gajjar Swadeshi pills, not potency pills, but for plague, that were very much widely used in India. Then I see so many advertisements by Jandu Pharmacy. This Jandu Pharmacy, Jandu belonged to 18th century from Jamnagar. And his advertisement started coming in late 19th century. I'm talking. Along with that, we see multinationals putting up their advertisements. For instance, advertisements for bicycle. Indians did not know how to ride on bicycle, with the result that the British manufacturers employed Kirloskar, Lakshmanrao Kirloskar, to teach Indians how to ride bicycle. I'm talking of the year 1898. This is followed by Gandhi. And he put lot of importance to celibacy. In fact, he desexualized his followers. As early as in 1920. Then he started Sabarmati Ashram, followed by Gujarat Vidyapith, as you know. And he put emphasis on celibacy, and himself used to have Bakri noodles. Now, when this Swadeshi movement is taking place, how do these multinationals react to Swadeshi movement? You see, telephone advertisement, bicycle advertisement, even Ford's T car, T model, Ford's T model. We see some advertisements. Of course, there are very few buyers. There were only 18 cars in Ahmedabad in 1890. So how do we react to this?
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Oh, I've got so I guess one thing to say, in addition to what I said earlier, is that the vernacular producers are dominant in the vernacular papers until after World War I, until the 1920s. And so one of the things is that many of the firms that I'm talking about did not advertise in the vernacular papers, saying people who read vernacular papers don't have that much money, so they're not going to buy our products. That changes with the advent of professional advertising. They go into the vernacular papers realizing that there's a much bigger market out there. But this Swadeshi, I guess the thing I would say again is, they do try to meet Swadeshi in subtle ways, but it's very hard to meet it directly head on, to bring up the issue of nationalism and say, oh, nationalism is wrong, because most of their consumers don't think it's wrong. So they try to stress other factors like conjugality. And I think that's one of the possibilities that they had was nationalism, but they weren't going to do that because they were not Indian firms themselves. So they search for other things, and I think conjugality ends up being one place they end up, the main place they end up, because they don't have some of the other options. But interestingly, Horlicks by 1947, Horlicks is using nationhood and so on. So the counter, but they are trying to counter Swadeshi subtly, but they can't counter it head on.
And eventually, Lever Brothers changes its name to Hindustan. That is the ultimate strategic shift.
Yeah, that's post-independence. Yeah.
And any other questions? Just raise your hand. You have about a few minutes. I'll just take his point. Actually, I'll just take your point first.
So while going through the talk, I was trying to locate advertising as a contested space, especially in the early 20th century. for example, how the colonial depiction of Indian men, especially Bengali men, was as feeble, weak, effeminate, and then there were these counter movements where these gymkhanas came up everywhere, like especially in metropolitan cities. So I see advertisement as a contested space where it is not just that advertisement from global companies that are imposing on Indian men, but it is emerging out of this very complex political negotiations happening with the local cultural values. My first question is how, for example, in masculinity, the crisis of masculinity and sexuality is emerging out of these complex negotiations kind of were depicted in these advertisements.
Yeah. So I guess just to amplify, I think this could be clearer in my talk, but to a certain extent, I'm suggesting that notion of the crisis of masculinity was implicit in the vernacular advertisements very much. The idea of weakness runs through those non-global advertisements very heavily. And what happens in the 1930s is that the global companies say, we have to, because that's such a powerful way of selling goods. The global companies start to say, well, we've got to use that same theme. And so you see it in the Horlicks advertisements, and you see it in the tonics. So in the other kind of male tonics. To my mind, to some extent, the global companies appropriated that from the vernacular advertisers. So it's very much coming out of a notion that this is a powerful means of selling your goods in this time. In the 1920s, the emphasis on the weakness of men in the global companies is very minimal, but it really comes out in the 30s. And I would add that those sexual notions of sexual weakness start to get played up as well. So, but a very interesting question.
And the second question is around the women's participation, especially in the freedom movement. Since the entry of Gandhi, Swadeshi movement and non-cooperation movement, and their visibility in the public forums, and how that impacted their depiction in these advertisements.
Okay, now you're giving me a wonderful opportunity to tell the story that I was hesitating to tell. So basically, some of the global advertisers, including Unilever, came to the conclusion that because of the limited presence of women in the marketplace this is early 30s, that it's men who are making the decisions about what to buy. And so so you saw that image of Faluna where it's pitched to the men. Your wife is suffering, you help her. So this is so pitching to the men. But what happens is increasingly they realize they were wrong as the 30s goes on. And I think that you're making an extra additional point is that women's role in decision making is expanding. But other people have stressed also that women often were running the budgets of homes and so on. So the story is from Prakash Tandon, and in his book Punjabi Saga, and he tells a story of his first job was running a market survey, and so he was kind of helping a European who had come over to do this market survey, and the European said, we keep getting this result in our interviews, market surveys, that it's the husband who decides what products to buy. I don't really believe that. This is the European. And Prakash Tandon said, that's really a misunderstanding of Indian culture. And in Indian culture, the woman's job is to be obedient and deferential to the husband, and women don't make decisions like this. The woman is the Graha Lakshmi in the family, and so on. And so but Thompson Walker was convinced he's right. So they asked the women who were conducting the survey. They sent women, many of them were Christian women, into homes, and it asked for some follow-ups. So they go into the first home and they ask a woman, and she gives this, what he says, the stock answer: husband decides. And they press further, and the woman's eyes light up and says, "Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, husband decides, but I tell him what to decide." And after that, you see, women are always in the ads that Unilever runs. They're no longer in the background, and so I think you saw that little picture in the Lifebuoy of women being there. So that they recognize that women are important. But some of the other companies had realized this all along. Ovaltine is always selling directly to women, and so on. But it becomes more.
And interesting, Prakashan is one of the first chairmen of IIMA. Ahmedabad.
Yeah.
Generation of students have worked at
and I should say that he ends up, he tells this story as a funny story about himself and how he was so wrong. So he ends up saying, I had to go between with my head in my hands, and he was right and I was wrong.
So one last question, unfortunately, but we have some food outside and you can interact with them outside as well. So Professor, this will.
Professor Haynes, I have a very simple question. I think you took us through a very fascinating story, which is very interesting. But your advertisements that you are showing are in two languages. Primarily, they are in Gujarati, and the rest are in English. Now,
I use three: Marathi, English, and
let me just formulate my question. Now, because you are taking us through the entire history of vernacular, as you are saying, the advertisements that you are showing us is also a reflection of the kind of cultural context of a particular region. Now, were the other regions vis-a-vis the European advertisements, the English advertisements that you're talking about, were showing some other kind of context, like in Bengal, like in Tamil Nadu, or was it similar? Because it appears that everything is kind of a contextualization of the manner in which the Gujarati middle class was behaving at that point of time. Maybe the other middle classes were not behaving at that point of time in that manner. I don't know. I mean, I'm just very curious to know if you have come across anything of that kind. The Bengali middle class, for example, the Tamil middle class.
Western India should have been in the title of my book. It is Gujarat and Maharashtra, and I did use newspapers from Pune, as well as the newspapers, Gujarati newspapers from Mumbai, and Gujarati newspapers from here, as Professor Mehta pointed out. But someone else is going to have to do the research on the other areas, because I can't say, and I can with help on the Marathi, I can go through the Marathi. The Gujarati, I have some reading ability, but Bengali would I can't make out the alphabet. So
my question only was because you were saying the Indian advertisements, primarily it's also a regional logic that decides your advertisements. You're privileging certain particular kind of advertisements rather than all advertisements, and therefore it's reflecting only one side, of the Western side. And maybe that is also perhaps because the capitalism that you're talking about is perhaps emerging in a very different way in this region than other regions. And also, was there a kind of a critical middle class at that point of time in terms of its size that was responding to these English advertisements?
Okay, well, that's a very interesting point at the end that you've made, and I want to stress that. Let's say the advertisers themselves until the 1920s, they started to think that their only audience was going to be Europeans and very elite Indians who knew English and who wished to imitate Europeans. So that's part of the story. And during the course of the 1920s, this is the social aspects that I haven't talked about, but Chinmay mentioned. There's an expanding middle class, many of whose members do not speak English and so on. And these companies are starting to realize we've got to get access to them, and we've got to change our methods, because these are people who don't want to emulate the British at all. So it's going well beyond that kind of elite group to the middle class might be said to, some of these middle class, when we think of middle class, we're talking about people whose families earned 150, 175 rupees a month. So these were people who end up being classified as middle class. They're not wealthy people that these companies are starting to sell to. They're moving beyond the elite, but it's not. There's many, there's still 2/3, 3/4 of society that's poorer than them that they're not trying to reach. So I may have lost the thread there, but.
All right, we'll have to. Great. There's some food outside, and please indulge, and you can feel free to interact with Professor Duff. Thanks again, and this is the book. If you're interested in advertising, marketing, get it. We want to give a small memento.
Oh.
What? All right, come.
Okay. This will go along with my IIM T-shirt. Thank you.
And maybe one with the book. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So how do we get everything?
Great. All right. See you guys outside. And just one last announcement. If you've not seen the photo exhibit yet, Dom 15 is very close by. I think today is the last day. You just walk. It's a 30-second walk. There's some nice photographs of the campus of the past. So feel free to go to Dom 15.
Thank you. Oh, yep. Nice. I realize he's technically the one who's supposed to close.
Yes.